wrote of natural laws and self-evident truths. The United States Declaration of Independence is a document based on the ideals of the Enlightenment. In the Enlightenment, a new world order was conceived. And France, the home of the Enlightenment, was ruled by a very unenlightened government, and the time was ripe for revolt. So it is fitting that we have chosen France as the backdrop for our debate today, resolved that civil disobedience is a more effective way to achieve lasting social and political change than is violent revolution. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our debaters today. On the affirmative, we have Mohandas Gandhi, Hindu nationalist leader. And representing the negative, we have American revolutionary Thomas Jefferson, and Mary Wollstonecraft, British author and feminist. I'm going to go out on a limb today and say that I believe that this is the first time in the history of the world, on this stage in North Idaho College, that there has been a conversation between these three great people.
That is true.
That is true.
That is true.
For our debate, we will open first with Mr. Gandhi. He will make his proposition, his ideas for the proposition known, and then we will open up the floor for cross-examination of Mr. Gandhi, and then we will in turn go to the negative. Later on, we will hope that our audience will come forward to ask questions of our debaters. And you are the ones who are going to determine who wins the debate today. Mr. Gandhi.
The thing about nonviolence, as I see it, is that on a more likely than not basis, less people will be hurt. That itself is a benefit. I think it is well known that there will be, from time to time, in countries all over this world, revolutions of one kind or another. We have witnessed, as we all know, the French Revolution. We have seen violence in the southern United States when they fought the North. But could those same events, those revolutions, have occurred without the use of violence? And thus, a more peaceable change occurred. In other words, is revolution necessarily violent? The answer is, it is not. There are times in nonviolent revolutions, of course, that people will be hurt. But it is not a necessary act that we go out to hurt these people. You are, of course, no doubt aware of what we in India accomplished in a nonviolent revolution in getting rid of the British Raj and in bringing self-rule to India. We did it with peace in our hearts, not intending to hurt one Englishman, and in large measure we accomplished that task. The British left. 100,000 British tried to control 300 million Indians. It was inevitable that there would be a revolution, but we accomplished it without loss of life from our perspective. The key, however, was that we did it with love in our hearts for those who oppressed us. The secret, I submit to you, is that if you are going to have a non-violent act against an oppressor, you must be, as was I, and as were thousands of Indians, prepared to die. It is not a coward's way to not fight back. It is the braver of the acts.
Thank you, Mr. Gandhi. Do you have any questions to ask Mr. Gandhi?
I do have two of them I would address to him. I'm very curious, Mr. Gandhi, about how your culture arrived at having love for their oppressors, for people who were tyrannical over them.
You know, when I was a young lawyer, having been trained in Great Britain, I was in the Transvaal in South Africa, and because I was brown-skinned, I was a colored and not permitted to behave as the whites. We were required to have a pass to walk around. We began resisting the pass law by simply refusing to cooperate with it. We were beaten, we were hurt, we were killed, we were maimed, but in large measure we defeated the pass. And the spark began there. But as you know, my wife, who is now gone, married to her for 43 years, it was she who ultimately taught me nonviolence. You see, in the beginning I ruled over her with an iron fist. I demanded what I willed of her, and she was obliged, from my perspective, to give it to me. But the truth is that she taught me by resisting politely, that in the long term, I was stupid and she was bright. She resisted without ever striking back, with love in her heart, and it is she who taught me nonviolent resistance. And in the end, as you well know, I lived a celibate life. And I learned to love my wife more and learned to love people even better. And I thank her for that.
Mr. Jefferson, do you have any questions at this time?
No questions.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Jefferson, will you please provide your views on our proposition?
Well, first of all, let me say how unfitted I am for debate. I had a poor speaking voice and such a shy temperament that the idea of a formal debate almost brings on one of my characteristic migraine headaches. And I frankly don't wish to debate. I'm intrigued by this concept that you have briefly articulated. It would seem to me that if you can show that a culture can be overturned or revolutionized without violence, that every rational being would wish to follow such a recipe rather than the violent one. Blood is not something that a decent man would seek out. The question is whether it's inevitable in revolution or not. And in my time, in the 18th century, our experience and our reading taught us that bloodshed is the price of human liberty. I will be interested to know later how much actual violence occurred during your Indian Revolution. You spoke of some, but you minimized it, and I would like to hear more about that. Mr. Madison, the author of our Constitution, gave to the American people the greatest of all revolutionary tools. You have nonviolent mechanisms of revolution. You can return to private life all 435 members of your House of Representatives every second year. You can impeach your president or other high officials. You can amend your Constitution at any time. You can demand a new constitutional convention at any time. So these are mechanisms of nonviolent revolution that the American people invented. Such things were never known to humanity before. The notion of a constitutional convention to replace an existing form of government, this concept was unprecedented in the history of government until Mr. Madison invented it in Philadelphia one summer day in 1787. However, I do not believe from my own experience that revolution can occur without violence in every case. Let me give you two examples. Our revolution, of course, was a violent one. We rid ourselves of British colonial tyranny through war. This would not have come about, in my opinion, without warfare. Afterwards, two events occurred. One was an American event, and the other was, of course, the French Revolution. And I was the only American of any stature to defend them in the long run. The first was Shays' Rebellion in western Massachusetts in 1786. In fact, Shays' Rebellion precipitated the Constitutional Convention. The Constitutional Convention of 1787 was brought about in some part as a reaction to what was seen as the coming of anarchy in the American West. I was asked, like other Americans, to condemn Shays' rebellion, and I refused. Daniel Shays was a Revolutionary War veteran, a hero. He and his fellow farmers of western Massachusetts were being squeezed by economic forces beyond their control, largely results of the Revolutionary War. They asked the Massachusetts legislature to redress their grievances. The legislature ignored their needs, and eventually, after exhausting every peaceful means, Daniel Shays and his insurgents rose up and prevented foreclosures and closed some courts of law. This is known to history as Shays' Rebellion, and when I was asked to condemn it, I refused. And I said to Abigail Adams, my friend, I like a little rebellion now and then. It's as important in the political arena as thunderstorms are in the natural world. A thunderstorm clears the air. It restores health to the climate. Well, so too a little rebellion clears the political air, and above all reminds our government that it exists to serve the needs of the people and not the other way around. Government can never be too often reminded that it is our servant, and we are not its slaves. So I defended Shays' Rebellion, and Abigail Adams was a bit frightened by that. Well, later, when the French Revolution occurred, virtually all Americans welcomed it in the first instance, but when it began to turn sour, the terror, most serious American statesmen backed away from the French Revolution. John Adams called it the greatest cataclysm in human history. George Washington abhorred the excesses of the Revolution, and after the King and Queen were beheaded, most Americans looked upon it as the return of chaos and old night. Alone amongst American statesmen, I defended the Revolution, including the terror. And I'll never forget when Lafayette, the great French patriot, wrote me a lugubrious letter from France lamenting the excesses of the terror. I wrote back a rebuke, and I said, my friend, did you expect to be transported from despotism to liberty on a feather bed? And when William Short, my protege, wrote me an even more alarmed letter about what he took to be the innocent aristocrats who had been ground up in the terror, I responded with a serious criticism, a serious rebuke of his position. And I said, never has so much good been gained with so little innocent blood lost. Yes, friends of mine and people that we lament have been lost to the terror, but we must look upon them as we would look upon soldiers in a great battle or martyrs in a great cause. I said, rather than that revolution should have failed, I would have seen half the earth desolated if there were one Adam and one Eve alive in every nation and alive free. That would be greater than all of the despotisms of history. And finally, I said to another member of the Adams family, the tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants. That is its natural manure. So if you can show me a mechanism that is entirely peaceful and unbloody, that can lead to the establishment of life, liberty, property, equality, and the pursuit of happiness, then I, of course, will cheerfully agree. But until such proof is forthcoming, I must remind all of you that history teaches us that blood is the price of human liberty.
Thank you, Mr. Jefferson. Do you have any questions of Mr. Jefferson at this time?
Well, I would respond to the question he asked me. He began by asking whether or not in what we did in India, lives were lost. Well, of course, he knew the answer to that question. 500,000 Indians died. And you say, well, was that a passive situation? Was that nonviolence? And the answer is that that was the result of religious dispute and religious wars. And it is said, religion, religion, what sins are committed in thy name. It was not necessary and it need not have happened because, as you see, the Hindu and the Muslim lived together in India for thousands of years. There was no dispute. It was simply the politics of the day that caused Pakistan and India to be divided, and that was against my will. But whether or not the tree of liberty needs to be watered with the blood of tyrants, I say to you, no, sir. No, sir. Not so. When we in India took home rule from our oppressors, and the English were our oppressors, they gave us nothing and took all. We did so without firing one bullet, without beating one Englishman, though they beat us, though they shot us, and they did so for 100 years. We prevailed. Yes, yes, it need not be watered with blood.
Ms. Wollstonecraft, will you please give us your opinions about violence versus passivity?
I have some thoughts from the woman's point of view about passivity first. And the training that women during my period would have received about being passive and understanding the moral destruction to one who sits passively by and accepts the injustice of a husband who for 30-some years aggressively suppressed his wife. I would ask Mr. Gandhi what choice she had. Are there divorce laws in India? So the destruction both to the oppressor and the oppressed as far as their character goes is immeasurable. I would, however, wish to share my insights on the French Revolution. I was in France during the Terror, which I believe Mr. Jefferson was not. Before I went there, I was very idealistic about the goals of the revolution as Mr. Jefferson has presented them to you, and understanding that some violence might be of necessity. And when I heard before I went to France that a group of prisoners and priests had been murdered, I responded with the idea that did they expect to deal with sharp instruments and not be cut? However, in December of 1792, I did go to Paris. When I arrived there, the home where I was to stay was abandoned. It was quiet. The streets were filled with packs of people waiting to see Louis transported to his trials. He was on trial at that time. I was very ill. I had contracted a cold on my way there. There were no one but servants in the house. One evening, as I looked down into the streets, I saw Louis being transported to his trial. All the windows were closed in the houses. The doors were closed. It was a terrifying sight. For the first time in my life, I could not put out my candle for fear. I wished to see something alive. The streets were filled with death. I am a person who can barely watch a person presented dying on the stage. And yet, in 1793, I walked past the guillotine. I saw the blood. I did not view it as manure. I saw it as the horrifying reality that occurs when violence is taken to its logical conclusion. I was so frightened, I was so stunned by the event that I began to exclaim, and a citizen called me aside and said, "You must be quiet. You must go back into your house." I came then eventually to believe that it is the role of government to suppress violence, to prevent it, that it, in actuality, is the destruction of life and not a generation of people's rights.
Ms. Wollstonecraft, I'm having difficulty here. Are you in favor of nonviolence, or are you in favor of revolution? Supposedly you're on the same side as Mr. Jefferson.
Yes.
This is not clear to me.
I'm most certainly on the side of revolution. I believe that it is very much the time for a revolution, for instance, in the manners of women, to replace to them their lost dignity. And through teaching and through learning, to force them to reform themselves, and by that slow reformation to reform the world. That violence is not a matter which should be instructed into the young women who will be the revolutionaries, who will reform the world through their actions. So yes, I do believe in revolution, but a fruitful product of slow progress and understanding among the citizens in any country.
Do you have any questions?
Yes, indeed I do. You asked, Madam, about a woman who is in a marriage with a violent husband. What can she do? You asked if there was divorce in India. Of course there's divorce. Unfortunately, it's hard to give back the dowry in years past, but what a woman must do, and what women have done in India, and done so bravely, is to not submit. The key to nonviolence is not fear, but being at peace with herself. And what I'm about to say is something that you will not like, but some of those women will die, as Indians died, as men and women die. But they do so knowing that they are making a conscious choice to not submit. And if one woman can do it to her husband, a country full of people can do it to an oppressive government. And it has happened, and it shall happen in the future again.
Well, maybe we could look at it in a slightly different way. We all agree, I think, that violence is to be avoided where possible. But no one who is a fully civilized human being encourages violence or wishes to see it prevail in his culture. So the only defense of violence is if it does what it is intended to do, that it revolutionizes the society, and that society probably could not be revolutionized by any other mechanism. In other words, there's an argument from efficacy. Well, let's say that the only thing that stands between the French people and their natural rights is the death of Louis XVI. There are 20 millions of French people. There's one man called Louis XVI. If cutting off his head brings about liberty for the French people, that seems like a bargain worth making. Now, what if Louis XVI is surrounded by 100 key aristocratic courtiers and priests? If cutting off their heads brings about liberty for 20 millions of human beings, it seems like a bargain worth making. The terror, I believe, in all of its excesses, blown out of proportion by men like Burke and conservatives like Hamilton and Adams, the terror consumed perhaps 20,000 people in a nation of 20 millions. Is that an unnecessary bloodletting? I think not. Look at it this way. Voltaire said, in France, every man is either the hammer or the anvil. The people of France, as sovereign as you or I, for millennia were ground down by bad government, bad churches, bad class systems, superstitions, taxation, ruinous, hidebound, irrational institutions until their lives were so wretched that you cannot imagine their daily existence. And finally, thanks to the Enlightenment, they rose up and overthrew a tyrannical, irrational, and unjust regime, and perhaps 100,000 people were killed, 20,000 of which were noblemen. I see that as a measure, in some small part, of the years of violence against the people, the centuries of oppression of the people. In other words, when the people finally regain their rights, there will be a bloodletting, and the blood is in some regards a measure of the oppression that they are overcoming. I don't lose any sleep over this. I would rather that they did it with a plebiscite, but if they can't do it with a plebiscite, a guillotine seems fine.
May I ask a question of you, Mr. Jefferson?
Yes.
Would you not agree that it is unwise for one government or one power to overthrow another when all power intoxicates weak man?
Well, all power intoxicates. When I was in my first term, I said whenever a man casts his eye longingly on public office, a certain rottenness of character is sure to creep in. Yes, everyone who has power becomes intoxicated by it. I know of no exception in human history, not excluding myself. But we have this great security, thanks to Mr. Madison. We have a Constitution that binds power. Our President, our Congress, our Supreme Court are heavily bound down by limitations on their power, and the people have a right at any time to reclaim their natural sovereignty. So, yes, power corrupts, but you can create constitutions that have safeguards against this. Surely you are not arguing, madam, that the government of the United States, self-consciously constituted and ratified by the people themselves, is to be compared in any significant way with the kingships of George III or Louis XVI.
Absolutely not.
Well, then you take my point that there are different types of power, and when the people are ultimately able to limit that power, there's no special quarrel that they need to have with their government.
Mr. President, please understand, I'm a peaceable man by nature, by religion. I studied the Jain philosophy in my youth, so I do not want to kill, but I am not against violence in totality and never have been. I, in fact, served in the Army. And when one once asked by my son if he should have run away when I was shot at once, I said, no, you defend me. There are times to fight back, and I do not deny that. But is it necessary is the issue. And the answer is, it is not necessary, because there is an ultimate good in mankind. And no matter how despotic the government is, if you will allow the world to see how bad that government is, it will ultimately melt away. And the king to which you refer, who I did not know personally, lives just one lifetime. And as bad as he is, it will ultimately die. It may be a function of time, but as you say, you only had 100,000 people killed in the French Revolution. And when you say it quickly, it doesn't sound like much, but they did not necessarily have to die. There was an alternative way, even under a despot.
Well, let me ask you one last question. You said that hundreds of thousands of people died during the course of the Indian Revolution, but this was not specifically tied to the overthrow of the British Raj. This was more internecine struggle amongst Indians. Fair enough, so we'll discount that for the moment. Surely some died in the revolution itself, but I won't press you on that point. But you did say that the British Raj, the 100,000 British overlords stationed in a continent that they had no right to be on, maimed, tortured, murdered, and beat your people.
Is true.
Why not simply rise up and kill all 100,000 of them? I mean, is there a spiritual gain to being beaten in the name of liberty? I don't understand why you have a distaste for violence when your oppressors are using it in a daily way.
It is an intrinsic evil. And if you can avoid it, you avoid it. There is in this world a good and an evil. And good is better than evil. My goal in my life is to one day face God. And I wish to go to that God knowing full well that I never intentionally hurt another man. And if I can do that, then my work is well done. And that is my goal. If we could do it in India, if in the years to come they can do it in South Africa, if in years to come other locations also peaceably transfer that violent power that was oppressing people, the Martin Luther King in your country, ma'am, it was done peaceably. Were people hurt? Yes. But did the young people that came into the lunch counter in 1960 in North Carolina, did they sit there with peace in their hearts and say, let us have lunch, and be refused, and be beaten, and be arrested? Yes, they did. And what was the result? The result is that they won, and they did not fight back. They loved back.
We'd like to invite people from our audience to come. There's a microphone right here, and we would welcome your questions. And you can direct them to anybody on the panel. Go ahead. Thank you.
Good afternoon.
Just talk right into the mic there.
Good afternoon. My question is for Mr. Gandhi. A point Mr. Jefferson was making, I think, kind of slipped by, was you said that 500,000 plus Indians were killed in your revolution, and there was 100,000 oppressors. That's a 5-to-1 ratio. I believe you to be a humanitarian, sir. Would it not have been easier to go one-on-one, take 25% losses, lose only 125,000 Indians, the other 375,000 humanitarily spared?
The magic of numbers that you use is good, but did you listen carefully enough, sir? The question really was, how did those 500,000 die? And they died in a dispute between two religions, with politicians on the top of each religious triangle arguing and fighting with one another about power, those things were unnecessary. And it almost cost me my life when I fasted to prevent that very event from happening. Those people need not die, and they did not die in the ousting of the British from my country. So what I tell you is that we peaceably got rid of the British crown. Unfortunately, afterwards we made our own mistakes. But you know, the beauty of self-rule is that we can make our own mistakes. We don't need you to make them for us, British crown.
My question is for Mr. Gandhi. Could you tell me if your thinking has been influenced by the subsequent events of World War II and specifically the death camps?
You know, I was pointedly asked how one could nonviolently, on behalf of the Jews, this was in 1939, 1940, have responded to Herr Hitler. And I said that they could have done so because as bad as the German government was, there was a world that watched, and had those Jews, knowing that they were going to die, put themselves before the butcher's knife and allowed the world to see them go, all 6 million of them, they may have died just the same, but they would have done so under their terms and not under Herr Hitler's. Yes, I think it would have worked.
Thank you. Mr. President, could you, sir, please tell me, is your belief in reason in and of itself a rational position or a faith position? Thank you.
I think you all heard the question, is my commitment to reason a faith or a piece of science? That question would have seemed absurd in my time, and I must say what came out of Mr. Gandhi's mouth just now seems absurd to me. I'm a secularist. I'm a materialist. There's a Christian argument about violence. Christ suggests that in responding to violence with violence, there may be an efficiency to it, but that it is degrading to our own soul. I frankly don't see the point of this. I would rather persuade George III to grant us our liberty in an argument, in a declaration. That's not likely to work. I would rather use a plebiscite to declare independence. That's not likely to work. I would rather have an economic embargo, as I tried in 1807, or dump tea harmlessly into the waters in Boston Harbor. That is, to use property violence, but not human violence, to bring about liberation. I would prefer any mechanism short of blood. I never struck anyone in the whole course of my life. My temperament is decidedly pacific. But I don't think that an argument from the Spirit is a rational argument. First of all, we don't know much about the Spirit. It's unclear whether our souls are degraded by righting wrongs violently. I would not grant that automatically. I would prefer peace, but it's not clear to me that violence necessarily degrades the soul of the person who has to respond to oppression by using it. So my point is that if you can avoid violence, you should and must, but if you need violence, you ought to take a kind of statistical view of it. If 2 million Indians can overwhelm 100,000 British and bring liberation to themselves and to restore order on some sort of a rational basis, that would seem to me to be infinitely preferable to adhering to a life of the Spirit which may or may not actually exist, meanwhile being ground down by the Raj. I take a very statistical and a very rational view of this, and I don't think that reason is faith. I think reason is the truth, just as 2 and 2 makes 4.
Mr. President, there were not enough British bullets in India to kill all of us. And we could have walked over them had we wished to. But you see, you bottom your thought, I guess, with a Christian philosophy. But the world is not Christian. As a matter of fact, there are more non-Christians than Christians. And we on the other side of the world think somewhat differently. And we fervently believe that there is a soul in man, and it is good. And that is a service that we cannot shy from. So I suggest to you that my view, and I'm not shy to say this, is my opinion, and my opinion is right.
Mr. Gandhi, though, Mr. Jefferson brings up a very good point. He's coming at this whole argument from a very Western viewpoint. And we have to keep in focus now that the debate proposition claims that nonviolence is more long-lasting for social change than is violence. Okay, so we're keeping this debate issue in our minds. Once you were asked what you thought about Western civilization, and you responded, "I think that would be a very good idea." Is it not true that your brand of civil disobedience could only work in a culture such as your own, and that you saw nonviolence as mental and spiritual? This is very different than what Mr. Jefferson is saying. So in other words, nonviolence probably could never work in Western society, in Western culture, only in Eastern.
I put it to you that that is facially incorrect. You see, Atlanta, 1965, Georgia in your South, Martin Luther King undertook the very philosophy that I espoused. By the way, of course, I did learn it from Thoreau. It was not original. He used it, and he won. And ultimately, the kinds of oppression that he sought to overthrow, the unjust laws, I am not suggesting he cleansed the souls of all men. He did not. But it worked there. It worked in the West. It works in the East. So I do not agree that it is necessarily something that will only work in an Eastern country. It works everywhere. I'm convinced of that.
You have to remember, Mr. Gandhi, that our guests here have no clue about what you're talking about.
Yes. Well, in essence, in the years to come, you will discover that black people in the southern United States were oppressed. I think you must remember some of that, Mr. President. There were laws that prevented them from being treated equally. And the Constitution, which you, Mr. President, so aptly penned, permitted them to have their rights, which they were denied. And this young man, this young black minister, did exactly what I suggested. He boycotted the Atlanta bus system. He beat them at their own game. And ultimately, and it took a while, and it took some presidents, and it took some force, he overthrew those laws. He morally knew that he must disobey unjust laws. He did, and they are not the law any longer.
And yet, once again, we have a situation where you are not separating politics from religion. In our South, we had the same situation. We had Martin Luther King, who was a minister, and he saw that connection between politics and religion. Our esteemed guests here are part of the Enlightenment. They see a separation of religion and politics. So can't you see that this probably would not work in the same way that you see nonviolence working as a force for social change?
I just see people of all colors and creeds as being basically the same, their minds functioning the same. And I think the proof of the pudding is in the tasting. And it worked, East and West.
We have a question here.
Yes, Mr. Jefferson.
Could you speak up, please? Thank
Mr.
you.
Jefferson, I understand from what you're saying that you believe anyone who is oppressed and denied liberty has the right to rise up in violence against their oppressors. If that be true, would you feel the same if your slaves rose up in violence against you?
Absolutely. The question is, if my slaves rose up in rebellion against me, would they be just? And the answer is yes. My only book, Notes on Virginia, says that there is no attribute of the Almighty that could side with white slaveholders in the event of a slave insurrection. Justice is all on their side. Self-preservation is on our side. But justice is on their side. Thank God it never happened, because it would have been a civil conflagration. It probably would have led to the extermination of one race or the other. But absolutely, all the justice is in their side, and of course, this doctrine of rebellion applies to them. Fortunately, this didn't come about. Monticello was a very benign plantation under the ugly conditions of slavery. It was about as benign and kindly as it could get. But there's no part of me that would deny your proposition. I did not want it to come, but had it come, I would have had no choice but to swallow hard and admit the justice of the black cause.
Ray Wollstonecraft, do you have a response to that?
Regarding the issue of slavery, I concur completely with Mr. Gandhi. The oppression of a group of people and their suppression is indeed, as I mentioned earlier, an indignity both to the suppressor and the person suppressed. As I think of slavery, I see it as an economic issue. The slaveholders would hold that their economic status would be destroyed were they to let the slaves go. I see the issue of slavery as a human rights issue, and that it is very high time to rid ourselves of this intensely inhumane treatment.
Question?
Ultimately, it took violence when Martin Luther King was killed for his cause. It's not a question, but it's a comment.
Well, I'll swing it around to you. Don't leave so quickly. Please, make yourself comfortable. The violence was one-directional, and the oppressor oftentimes resorts through desperation by giving up their morality and raising the male fist. In fact, it should be, to coin the phrase from the French Revolution, the velvet glove that should have been used. And when black people, and white people as well, paraded for those rights, they were put upon with dogs, fire hoses, deputies on horseback. But what they did, if you remember your history, was to lay down and not resist passively by being angry. They simply said, do what you will with us. The fact that he was killed, the fact that I was killed, unfortunate fact of history, not necessary, and certainly not relevant in the big picture.
May I say, we'll take questions on any subject if you're growing weary of this debate. I want to make the case one more time for terror. Not that I like it very much, but I think it's important not to simply allow our civility and our pacific temperaments to get in the way of good sense. Let's say that the people of your community have a serious frustration about government, and so you send letters to the editor of your newspaper, and you contact your congressman, and they ignore you. And then you march peacefully in Boise, and you are ignored. And then you march peacefully in Washington, D.C., and you are ignored. And you send remonstrations and grievances and declarations of rights and pamphlets and your finest orators and petitions for constitutional change. You do everything according to the rules of peaceful participation in government, and nothing happens. No one will pay attention to your problem. Now go shoot a senator on your main street, and I assure you, you will get the attention of government. I urge you to wait until you have exhausted all peaceful means. But when you have exhausted peaceful means, if you shoot a senator on your main street, I promise you the attention you have been seeking will at last come. If it could be done otherwise, I would not advocate the violence, but that violence is the trigger which gets government to pay attention to the rights of man.
Would, Mr. President, the government listen just as well if every person here stopped paying their taxes? That would be the sound of silence, yes. They would hear that. And would that work? Well, in fact, it did in India. We stopped buying British cloth. We stopped buying their goods. They heard us.
I would like to make an observation, both gentlemen are speaking about this, about what occurred during the French Revolution as a result of violence and the cause of women's rights during that period. And I know that Mr. Jefferson will certainly remember that in the Constitution, which our mutual friend Thomas Paine wrote with Consordet, that there was within that Constitution full equality for women. And that when the Robespierre and the Jacobins chose to reject that Constitution and banish Cartier to prison, that the cause of women's rights, because of that violent act, began to crumble. The cause was further destroyed by an incredible act of violence when Charlotte Corday chose to stab Moret in his bathtub. She, being a 26-year-old woman, was vilified in the French press because she was a woman who had taken a knife and was counted as an old maid whom no other man would take a look at, and the cause of her violence was that she was witty, learned, and had a head full of knowledge. And in that case, her violent act, because she was a woman in particular, turned the cause of women's rights completely backwards, and out of the French Constitution went these equal rights for women. So that particular violent incident had a very negative effect.
I have always believed that women and men, high caste and low, are all the same. They're all God's creatures and should be treated equally.
Did we have a question down here? Thank you.
My husband and I made a tour in the East about 30 years ago, and we stopped at Monticello, and we saw it. And I thought the grounds were beautiful, and I thought the clock in the corner of the building was unusual. I came home, and I was telling my son about that, and he said, but he was a slave owner. And I said, well, everybody. I didn't get any farther than that, but he was a slave owner. If he was wonderful, how did he feel about it?
I stand convicted of being a slaveholder, and there's no way I can defend myself against this charge. I own 200 human beings. I bought and sold slaves in the course of my life. If that is an absolute issue for you, then you cannot take me seriously on any other ground. I only freed 8 slaves in the course of my life, 3 during my life and 5 at the time of my death. Whether this is an eternal blot upon my reputation and my achievement, I leave to you to determine, but I think the facts need to be submitted to you candidly. I wouldn't have freed the mass of my slaves, even if it had been economically feasible to do so for me, because as a paternalist, I believe they were better off at Monticello under my benign protection than they possibly could be loosed into a world where they had neither economic prospects nor rights. If we disagree about this, we simply will have to disagree. But I always remembered what the British moralist Samuel Johnson said. He said in 1777, perhaps you knew him, he said in 1777, isn't it interesting that those who yelp loudest for liberty are also the drivers of Negro slaves? So I simply admit to this as a terrible contradiction, possibly a hypocrisy.
Mr. Jefferson, what were the conditions for education for your slaves?
Oh, madam. This is such an easy thing for you to claim. Look, both you and I agree, as you well know, that education is the great revolutionary force in the world. I'm sorry we haven't talked about it more, because I do think that we share a positive commitment to education. I believe you educate the people, and they will take charge of their lives. That education is more potent than bullets, more potent than cannons, more potent than anything that humans can argue. And I think women should be educated alongside of men. In fact, I was the pioneer in women's education in Virginia. I would not, however, have taught my unskilled field laborers to read and to write, because if you teach them to read and to write, they will, of course, demand their freedom. If you're not prepared to free them, then you mustn't teach them what freedom is. It would be idiotic to teach them to demand their freedom if you're not prepared to grant it to them. It's a paradox, I know. I gave them skills, and the ones that I offered manumission to, freedom to, were the ones that had skills in carpentry, joinery, masonry, bricklaying, other practical vocational skills that might find them employment in the outside world. But to begin a program of literacy at Monticello or at Mount Vernon would be to invite bloodshed on a chaotic, wholesale level in Virginia, and no rational being would do it.
And no manure in the ground for that.
You have to move your business to Mexico or Taiwan if you lost your slaves.
If I said the economics of slavery were a mere bagatelle, it wouldn't have cost me a moment's sleep on the economic side. The question is, when you have the wolf by the ears, what do you do about it? When you're born into a world of slavery, you must know this, Mr. Gandhi, some conditions are so thick, so dense, so intractable, you can't simply come through and sort them out like pieces on a chessboard. We were born into a world of slavery. Every fifth Virginian was a slave. You can't say one day, oh, now that we understand the doctrine of human rights, we're sorry this ever happened, please now go free. You cannot undo the psychic damage of slavery overnight, not in a decade, possibly not in a century. So once you are in this ugly, degrading institution, to extricate yourself is almost an impossibility. And I said, and I agree with Mrs. Wollstonecraft, and I take it with Gandhi, that the man must be a prodigy whose manners and morals are not depraved by being involved in a slave economy. The oppressor is degraded at least as much as the oppressed. But don't think that we didn't bring good faith to this question. We weren't arguing out of mere self-interest. We were arguing out of an impossible dilemma. And men of brilliance, Madison, Monroe, Washington, Patrick Henry, John Randolph, perhaps I myself, spent their lives trying to figure out how to extricate ourselves from the slave economy, and we couldn't do it, and in the end we threw up our hands in despair, and you know in the end the only thing that solved this problem was a civil war. So this is not a question of blind self-indulgence or self-interest. This is a question of human tragedy.
Mr. President, I listened carefully, and I'm not at odds with everything you said, but were I a slave, I would rather starve to death free than continue to live eating your bread.
Fair enough. I believe many slaves felt that. Many other slaves felt otherwise. Slaves were routinely offered manumission in Virginia, and the results were very mixed. Some slaves agreed to take it, and some slaves refused. Some slaves who did take their freedom failed miserably and came back to plantation life. Some were able to succeed in a modest way. We cannot generalize, but the fact is that most slaves at Monticello, had I come on any given day and said, please, determine your own destiny, most slaves would not have walked away. That is not to justify slavery, merely to suggest that most slaves were unprepared for freedom.
If ignorance is bliss, that's what we had, I should think.
There's no part of me that wishes to defend myself on this cause.
And I do not chastise you for living at that time.
Mr. Jefferson, you speak with great verve and enthusiasm about the necessity for violent overthrow now and then, and you talk about the fact that perhaps at some times blood must flow. Now, in your own experience, were you ever involved in any kind of street action? Were you ever involved in any kind of bloodshed, or were you the man that sat at Monticello and came up with wonderful theories and rational ideas?
Yes, I was an aloof philosopher who said all men are born equal. All men are entitled to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. All human beings, once freed, should be educated and participate in self-government, that church and state should be separated for the good of both institutions. Those and other pieces of mere rhetoric I spun out alone at Monticello.
And you never then participated in any kind of bloodshed or put your life on the line, so to
I have
speak.
the unfortunate habit of being candid, so I will now make it even easier for you to assail me. When I was in Paris, I witnessed the fall of the Bastille on the 14th of July, 1789, and actually had a hand in bringing the key to the Bastille, which was a symbol of the whole history of oppression in France, back to the United States. You know, the French people wanted to give that key to one person in the world, George Washington, because they believed, rightly, that the little flame that we lit on the 4th of July, 1776, was the flame that was going to engulf the world, and I dare say it came to engulf India too. So they wanted to praise the man that they saw as the pivotal being, George Washington. Yes, and when I was crossing Paris one day on a diplomatic errand, there was a street riot. There were street riots in the years leading up to the revolution, and this was really the beginnings, the rumblings of that volcanic activity. And this will tell you something about human habit. Here were these peasants, many of them women, mostly protesting and rioting over the question of nutrition. This wasn't a question of philosophy. This was a question of bread in one's stomach. And they were rioting, and when they saw my gilded diplomatic carriage at the corner of this plaza, the riot actually stopped, and I was allowed to pass through because I was known to be a diplomat. And I passed through the center of what had been bricks and stones and fire a moment ago. And as soon as I had reached the other side of the square, they resumed their riot. Now, if that's not a symbol of the paradox of revolution, I don't know what is. But there was still a sufficient reverence for authority, particularly diplomatic authority in France, that these rioters felt they must, in some regards, defer to the majesty of an American diplomat. They didn't know I was an American, but they knew that I was a man of some importance. So no, I never was in a street action. I said I never struck anyone in the course of my life. I was never struck. I refused to whip slaves. I said if they are recalcitrant to the point of requiring whipping, then we must sell them. But Monticello is not going to be a violent plantation. I believe economic embargo is preferable to war. I believe that education is preferable to a pitchfork. And I believe that my contribution to the history of civilization in language, in doctrines from natural law, is infinitely more potent than a brick.
And I want to compliment you for not whipping your slaves.
Thank you.
We have a question here.
Yes, my question is directed to citizen Thomas Jefferson. America has gone past its revolution. It's in a sort of a post-revolutionary period, you might say, and now we are exporting more than democracy around the world and have been accused of cultural imperialism. And what I'm getting at is the notion that one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. And if we have people in other countries around the world who are feeling oppressed and exploited and their natural resources depleted and their ways of life changed, and indeed killed and working in slave labor conditions and all of the kinds of things that we protested here, and if they do not have atomic bombs, aircraft carriers, large armies, and so on and so forth, would you then say that their terrorist activities against us in their own countries and even delivering the poor man's atomic bomb in the form of biological warfare, which was not unknown in your time with giving Indians infected blankets and things like that from smallpox and so forth, would that then, under your own principles of revolution and blood as fertilizer, are they justified in attacking us with the only means they have in order to liberate themselves from what they perceive to be the great Satan?
Well, I believe strongly the earth belongs to the living and not to the dead. And therefore, it's not my business to tell you whether their cause is just or not. If you are, in your time, an empire that oppresses other peoples, economically, politically, or militarily, then according to my doctrine, they would have a right to resist as peacefully as possible and as bloodily as necessary. So yes, I can see that happening. I would hope that the United States would remain an isolationist nation and not interfere in the sovereignty of any other people on earth for any reason at any time. But if you are an oppressor, then certainly. But keep this test in mind, and this, I think, is an implied criticism of post-Gandhian India, but keep this test in mind. The test of a revolution is what the revolutionaries do once they have come to power. That is the ultimate test of the virtue of any group of men. Think of my generation. We came to power, overthrowing the British overlord. What did we do with that power? We immediately divided it and subdivided it and hamstrung it and constitutionally limited and turned to the people and widened their franchise and educated them and granted them more liberty and more authority than any government in human history had ever done, and that was just the beginning. In other words, we used our power with such restraint and such deep respect to the people that we deserve your praise. Some of us are imperfect men. I'm a slaveholder. Another founding father might have been oppressive to his wife. Another might have been insufficiently respectful of Indian rights. These are problems, and they're not inconsiderable. But my generation, on the whole, represents the finest flowering of human self-restraint once power has come. You know, the best thing that was ever said of me was said by my enemy, my cousin John Randolph of Roanoke. He came to despise me, but he later said in life, there has been only one leader in human history that I know of who, when he was offered the mitre, said no and gave it back to the people themselves, and that was Thomas Jefferson in his first term between 1801 and 1804. I take that to be the highest praise that a revolutionary can ever receive. The ones you're talking about are the ones who come to power and then use the same oppressiveness that their predecessors showed, and this time they find new convenient enemies and create new colonies and new oppressed classes. And I think you've already admitted that in India there were so many internecine struggles, so many self-divisions, so many civil conflagrations, that in some highly irrational way, the Raj at least was able to keep an uneasy peace amongst those factions, that liberty, when it came, was something that the Indian people were not entirely prepared for.
Using the retrospective scope, I was wrong, but I never admitted that during my life.
Ms. Wollstonecraft?
I would observe that the only kind of war that I feel is defensible is a war against invasion. And that if women were educated to be patriots, they might join in. Now, don't misunderstand me. I don't mean for them to turn the distaff into a sword. In fact, I really mean to turn the sword into a plowshare. But I do believe that there is, on occasion, in case of invasive war, justification for bloodshed.
At this time, what we'd like to do is have our esteemed guests, our debaters, break character and perhaps introduce themselves, and we can continue to answer questions. However, they will be answering as themselves or giving insights through their own eyes using the character's background. Harvey Richmond is an attorney here in town, as Mr. Gandhi. Do you have any insights for us?
I shared with you all what Gandhi actually did respond to the issue of Nazi Germany. I do not believe that he was correct. I think he was wrong. Even though when we look at Tiananmen Square and we see the one man standing in front of the tank, he stopped the tank, but he didn't solve the problem. And Gandhi truly believed that the good and the morality of the world and of governments themselves and of people themselves would win in the long run. I question whether he is always right when someone is as despotic as some governments we now know to exist. So he may have been wrong there. And lastly, I leave you with this. And you heard me say a few times in character, and I now share with you out of character. Gandhi knew he was right, never admitted he was wrong, and he was a rather difficult fellow to deal with.
Dr. Johnson?
Yes, I hope that you've been able to determine from my rather wishy-washy comments that Mary Wollstonecraft was very ambiguous about violence. That, as I tried to share with you, she was very idealistic, that she, I think, had no real notion about what bloodshed meant. And in the abstract, violence and takeovers were important to her. But when she saw the blood on the streets, when she saw Louis being carried off, when she knew that her friends were being guillotined themselves, she then turned away from the idea and notion of violence as a means, and as I said, thought that governments should prevent violence. But again, she says, well, if there's a war of invasion, then we should defend ourselves. So she was very, very ambiguous about violence. She was certainly not in favor of pacifism. I think you'd catch that this taking injustice makes a person unjust. And part of the ambiguity then is, how do you deal with that? So she was ambiguous.
Did violence ever support the cause of women in the history of the world? I mean, haven't women always been on the downside of that, the losing side of violence?
Well, I'm thinking of the suffragettes in England in particular who were certainly victims of violence and underwent intensely horrible treatment in jailings and forced feedings and so forth, and that violence did not gain anything for the oppressors, and it was really more of a Gandhi-esque move for them to resist and to keep going back and back and back, so that absorbing the violence, I guess I would say, would alter that. I do want to share this tidbit of information about women's suffrage. That women's suffrage did not come to the United States until 1919, in England 1927, and in France, which was the hotbed of feminism, 1945.
Those of us in Idaho got the vote before
That's correct.
France.
That's right.
Dr. Jenkinson.
Well, this has been a hard and frustrating debate for me because, first of all, I don't agree with all the things that I have to say to be a good historical character, but also I think Americans have a very hard time making any sense of this. On the one hand, when the Oklahoma City bombing occurred or when the Unabomber was captured, there were editorials and sermons all over the country denouncing this as the worst sort of thing that could possibly happen, the coming of barbarism and un-American and how dare they and so on. And one takes the point, especially if you know anyone who's ever been involved as a victim in something like this. On the other hand, we are the most violent, industrialized people on earth, and violence is just pervasive in this culture. Now we're, of course, hearing all about it all over again, thanks to what happened in Arkansas the other day. But I heard again last night that the average child in America has seen 17,000 television murders by the time she is 18 years old. That's a remarkable set of cultural encodings, I would say. So we have a very ambivalent feeling about violence in the United States. On the one hand, we deplore Timothy McVeigh and we deplore the Unabomber. On the other hand, we absorb, in one level of acceptance or another, a very, very high level of routine, random street violence in this society. And I think what Jefferson would want to say about this is that violence may or may not be justified, but violence, if it's going to be used, should be surgical violence that tries to bring about the world that one is trying to see actualized. In other words, robbing a liquor store is a kind of violence that Jefferson would have no respect for. But violence to bring down the French regime or to bring down the current Chinese regime is violence that has more legitimacy in the eyes of someone like Thomas Jefferson. I think Jefferson would have very mixed notions, mixed reviews of the revolution in India or indeed the black civil rights movement in the United States. It seems to me that there's a very serious debate ongoing about whether those were truly nonviolent revolutions and whether they really lived up to the promise that was made for them by their great pacifist articulators. So I think the jury is still out on this question, but I think that Americans are really squeamish in talking about it. The paradox is that violence is just an everyday event in every community in this country, so I don't quite know how to resolve this issue.
Do we have a question here?
I have two questions. I have one for each, Mr. Gandhi and for the revolution. You continually talked about in the South and during the riot, or during the time of Martin Luther King in the South, and maybe it was true that the efforts of Dr. King and the peaceful marching and peaceful demonstration and everything brought the consciousness of America to the point that we focused on the civil rights. But wasn't it really what brought about the actual change was the rioting, the work of the Black Panthers and their threat of violence, the assassination of Dr. King, that actually gave the catalyst for the change to actually happen, that the fear of this violence that we were going to burn down our own country and that?
As Gandhi, I would say no. As Harvey Richmond, I would say no. And the reason I say no to both is because Gandhi would have believed in the system, that nonviolence works, and I think ostensibly when you view it, you think it does. And as an American who lived through that, I do not think that the violence that was part and parcel of the Black Panther Party materially contributed to it. Matter of fact, had there been more of it, there may have been a greater backlash, and there may have been more shooting in the streets, and then the righteousness of the passive aspect of this would have failed. And that's what makes it work, the ultimate morality of the people in seeing that right must be done.
On the other side, you talk about the French Revolution and all the violence and the reign of terror, and they beheaded the king and rounded up and beheaded all the aristocracy, and got their constitution and their freedom, and then they returned around and replaced all that with the absolute emperor who marched them all off to war in the goal of expansion and all that, and to lose a war in Russia. I mean, what did they, they traded one for the exact same thing in a different name, so how did revolution serve their purpose there?
Jefferson was a true believer in some moods. That's what's so strange about him. You hear all this violent talk coming out of Jefferson's mouth. It's so odd to hear this. First of all, he was never in a street action. He never struck anyone. He's really a pacifist. He's a very humane and harmonious human being, and yet all these wild talk comes out of his mouth. Connor Cruz O'Brien has a recent book called The Long Affair, Jefferson and the French Revolution, in which he says Jefferson is himself responsible for, in some way, is himself responsible for what happened in Oklahoma City, and himself responsible in some way for the freemen of Montana and for Randy Weaver and this whole movement. And there's some truth to that. When Timothy McVeigh was arrested, he had on a Jefferson T-shirt that said the tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots. These guys all do. The freemen, it's like there's a catalog, 1-800-RIGHT-WING, and they can order Jefferson paraphernalia, bookends, posters, but somehow Jefferson is the articulator of the far right patriot movements, the militia movement's doctrine. And Connor Cruz O'Brien thinks that Jefferson is really a dangerous man. And if you listen to the stuff I've had to say, he is in some regards a dangerous man. But I think Jefferson was right about the French Revolution. He said, these people, and I think he would say the same thing of the Indians, they weren't ready for liberty. You can't take Western-style liberty and impose it overnight on a people who haven't been prepared for it. And to do that is a formula for disaster. And he said, if the French go too far too fast, it'll lead to a dictatorship. It did. He said, if the South American republics go too far too fast, military dictatorships. It happened. And I'm sure if he had been alive, I try not to be anachronistic, but I'm sure if he had been alive at the time of the Indian Revolution, he'd say, it's a great idea, but are the Indian people capable of living with any level of Western-style mutual respect and due process and constitutionality? Otherwise, this might actually be doing them a disservice. I think the jury's still out on that. India right now is a powder keg of religious strife that may go up at any time. Now, that doesn't justify the Raj, obviously. But Jefferson's view, and I think Wollstonecraft's too, was people have to have the habits of liberty before they can have the stuff of liberty.
Right.
I think we have time for one more question.
Over the centuries, the government and the church has had a division of power over its society and its people. And in the last 3 or 4 generations, our family structure in this country has deteriorated substantially. I think this is, most of us would agree across the country. The question is, what would you recommend to our government to help our families build new American family traditions?
Please.
Whoa.
Please.
Thank you. Mary should know
Nice
this,
they
shouldn't
defer to
Mary?
the woman for a change.
Yes, I'm supposed to have the answer. Well, speaking as Mary Wollstonecraft, I would argue that educating women as fully as they can be educated is the answer to eventual, and she's always for eventual, understanding of the need for harmony. that if any group of people is repressed and held back, that they are not going to advance. And that I used a metaphor earlier that she had that was one that Thomas Jefferson used. If we just would not oppress people in any way, the law of gravity would pull people into their natural positions. Speaking as a woman, I am the modern woman who is torn, who has a family, who has a job. Where is the balance in that life? I think there has to be deliberate choice made on the part of men and women that the family is central to the sanity of a culture, in any culture, Western or Eastern, and that selflessness becomes the key to that. And that's a very difficult thing to see. It's a hope for, as Thomas Jefferson would say, the world belongs to the living, but with a looking to the future, that unless you are yourself selfless and see the future, there will be no hope. So I'd say selflessness.
Well, that seems like getting back to the economy that allows the natural abilities, like Jefferson was talking about earlier, about having the nurturers at home longer and not having to have so much money to live. And so there was more kind of peace at home, and home was more attractive as far as a central place for the family, so the children could have more nurturing.
If you want a dysfunctional family, you should have lived at the Wollstonecraft. Mom was home all the time, and that family was a horrible family. There was another family that Mary Wollstonecraft supported, the Blood family. Again, a terribly dysfunctional family. The only way, the father was a ne'er-do-well. The mother and the daughters earned the living of that family by doing stitchery, so it barely kept them alive. So when Mary went out of the home and became a writer and became the new genius and was independent, she supported all these people. So I'm not sure that staying home and nurturing is the answer. I think nurturing is definitely the answer. But if people are educated and understand their roles, and they understand, Mary Wollstonecraft was so far ahead of her time, I have to tell you this. She had books on raising children and educating children, and her beliefs in the time that needs to be spent with young children by both parents, the time that needs to be spent with them, educating them to the age of reason so then they understand one another, of co-educating them so they know how to get along with one another. These are ideals that I think we still haven't necessarily followed through on. But to offer people choices, and Mary was very strong on that, to say, what is it that women can do? Well, they can run governments, they can run businesses, they can enter into agreements and contracts, but because they are held back, they can't do that. But they can also make the choice then to be nurturers. Our culture doesn't reward that. So in a way, you're right about the economy, that mother is cheap.
Well, then I wasn't really trying to make a gender issue out of that, nurturing.
Okay.
Well, I mean, I think Gandhi has more to say about this than either of these two, because the peculiar paradox of American history with respect to, say, the family is that and the Enlightenment brought classical liberalism, and classical liberalism is not to be confused with our term liberal. Classical liberalism is the laissez-faire economy, in which the government really lets the economy have its own dynamism. It liberates institutions, people, and corporations to behave economically without restraints. If you add that concept, which was unprecedented in Jefferson's time, to the fact of America, this continent filled with almost unbelievable resources, gold, oil, coal, lead, timber, farmland, that Enlightenment laissez-faire model of libertarian government, coupled with the bounty of America, coupled with the most restless and acquisitive people who ever lived on earth, is a formula for trouble in the family. The family is, and we don't like to face these truths, but if you study comparative culture, the family is doing better, is more healthy in all cultures that are less capitalistic than they are in this one. Capitalism, whatever its greatness, and we're all the beneficiaries of it, whatever its greatness, it is extremely erosive of family and indeed community. And so, in a sense, the secularization of culture that Jefferson and the Enlightenment brought about liberated unprecedented energies in civilization, and no one would decry the American success story. At the same time, that secularization, which is befuddling to an Easterner like Gandhi, it has also, in some regards, been extremely acidic in terms of what we call family values. And so one argument that could be made, I'm not necessarily making it, but an argument could be made that the Enlightenment has run its course and we've produced about enough tennis shoes. And now we need to start thinking about some other values, and those values have more of a spiritual ring to them than the kind of massive materialist secularism that Jefferson represents, and that really points towards sort of what Gandhi was saying, that there are spiritual things that go beyond shoes.
And one of the things Gandhi pushed was not only homespun, because it filled in the lapsed time, and it was an effective boycott to British goods, but it was an item that everybody in the family could do. Everybody could take their time spinning and making homespun, and the family unit was important, though his family unit was bad, as was yours apparently. But it didn't work for him, and he did preach for the other people in India, and he also wanted to limit it to 2 to 3 children. He was very much against any act of, shall we say, personal procreation beyond the 3rd child, which should have been forbidden.
Unfortunately, we are out of time, and we will not determine who won this debate, but we do hope that you will continue the conversation among yourselves as you leave today. And will you join me in thanking our scholars today for bringing us such a wonderful program?